Catherine's small feet pattered across the hardwood floor of her parents' bedroom, her excitement barely contained. The walk-in closet beckoned, a treasure trove of grown-up clothes and shimmering accessories. She slipped inside, inhaling deeply. The scent of her mother's perfume enveloped her, transporting her to a world of make-believe. Her fingers trailed along the silky fabrics of dresses hanging neatly in a row. She stretched up on her tiptoes, reaching for her mother's jewelry box. It was heavy in her hands as she carefully set it down on the floor, cross-legged in front of it. The lid creaked open, revealing a glittering array of necklaces, rings, and bracelets. Catherine's eyes widened with delight. She plucked out a string of pearls, draping them around her neck. They clinked together as she moved, the weight unfamiliar but thrilling. Next came a pair of clip-on earrings, emerald green and sparkling. She fumbled with the clasps, eventually managing to attach them to her earlobes. They pinched a bit, but she didn't care. In the full-length mirror propped against the wall, she admired her reflection. The little girl staring back at her looked like a princess. As she reached for a ruby bracelet, her fingers brushed against something tucked away in the corner of the jewelry box. Frowning, she pulled it out. It was a crumpled piece of paper, folded haphazardly. Catherine smoothed it out on the carpet, curiosity piqued. It was a receipt from Hartman's Jewelers, the fancy store downtown, where her mother sometimes shopped. Catherine's brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of the information. 2 watches were listed, identical models with exorbitant prices that made her eyes widen. A memory surfaced. Just a few nights ago, her father had shown her his new watch, a birthday gift from her mother. He'd been so proud, holding out his wrist for her to see. "It's very special," he'd said, his eyes twinkling. "But don't tell your mom. Your macaroni picture frame is still my favorite gift." Catherine had giggled, pleased at being part of a secret with her dad. But now, staring at the receipt, confusion settled over her. Why were there 2 watches listed? Her father only had one. Where was the other one? She folded the receipt carefully, tucking it into the pocket of her play dress. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Maybe her mom had bought an extra one for herself. Or maybe it was a mistake at the store. Still, something nagged at her, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. Shaking her head, Catherine tried to refocus on her game of dress-up. She slipped her feet into a pair of her mother's high heels, nearly toppling over as she stood. Giggling, she took a few wobbly steps, imagining herself as a glamorous movie star. But her heart wasn't in it anymore. The receipt in her pocket felt heavy, like a secret she wasn't sure she wanted to keep. She glanced back at the jewelry box, wondering if there were other hidden things inside. The thought made her uncomfortable. Catherine carefully removed the borrowed jewelry, placing each piece back where she'd found it. She closed the lid of the box with a soft click, suddenly eager to be out of the closet. The smell of her mother's perfume, once comforting, now felt cloying. Later that afternoon, she found her father in the living room. He was settled in his favorite armchair, newspaper spread out before him. Catherine hesitated in the doorway, the receipt crinkling in her pocket as she shifted from foot to foot. "Daddy?" she said softly. He looked up, smiling warmly. "Hey, sweetheart, what's up?" Catherine crossed the room, her hand slipping into her pocket. "I found something," she said, pulling out the crumpled paper. "In Mommy's jewelry box." Her father's brow furrowed slightly as he took the receipt from her. "What's this?" he asked, unfolding it. Catherine watched his face carefully as he read. She expected him to laugh, to explain away the mystery of the 2 watches. Instead, she saw his expression change, hardening into something she didn't recognize. 2 watches, he muttered, his voice low and tight. "Is it a mistake?" Catherine asked, her voice small. "Did Mommy buy one for herself, too?" Her father didn't answer right away. He stared at the receipt for a long moment, then folded it slowly and deliberately. When he finally looked at Catherine, his smile seemed forced. "It's nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart," he said, but his voice sounded strange. "Thank you for showing me this." He stood abruptly, tucking the receipt into his own pocket. Catherine watched as he left the room without another word, his shoulders tense. The silence he left behind felt heavy, oppressive. She stood there, still wearing her mother's 2 big shoes. The game of dress-up suddenly felt childish, silly. Something had shifted, though she couldn't quite grasp what it was. All she knew was that the receipt had caused a change in her father, and it scared her. Catherine slipped out of the high heels, leaving them in the middle of the living room floor. She padded back to her own bedroom, closing the door behind her. Crawling onto her bed, she hugged her favorite stuffed bear tightly to her chest. She tried to make sense of what had happened, but her young mind couldn't quite piece it together. All she knew was that she'd unleashed something, a storm brewing just beyond her understanding. As she buried her face in her bear's soft fur, Catherine wished she could go back to that morning, before she'd ever opened her mother's jewelry box. The innocence of her earlier play felt like a distant memory now. In its place was a growing unease, a sense that something in her world had fundamentally changed. And deep down, though she couldn't articulate it, Catherine feared that things would never be quite the same again. Catherine hugged her teddy bear tightly as raised voices echoed through the walls of her bedroom. The angry words, muffled but unmistakable, made her squeeze her eyes shut. She'd never heard her parents fight like this before. The shouting had become a nightly occurrence since that day she'd found the receipt. She buried her face in her bear's worn fur, trying to block out the sounds. But the words seeped through, sharp and cutting. "How could you do this?" Her father's voice, usually so calm, trembled with rage. "It's not what you think." Her mother's response was shrill, defensive. Catherine pulled the blanket over her head, creating a cocoon of false safety. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew it was bad. Very bad. The next morning, an uneasy silence filled the house. Catherine crept downstairs, her stomach tight with anxiety. Her father sat at the kitchen table, staring into his untouched coffee. He looked up when she entered, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough. Catherine mumbled a quiet "good morning" and poured herself a bowl of cereal. She ate mechanically, sneaking glances at her father. The dark circles under his eyes, the slump of his shoulders. He looked like a different person. Her mother breezed in, all fake cheer and brittle smiles. "Hi, honey," she said, dropping a quick kiss on Catherine's head. "I've got to run to work. Have a good day at school." And she was gone, the front door closing with a decisive click. Catherine watched her father's jaw clench, his knuckles white around his coffee mug. At school, Catherine moved through the day in a daze. Her teacher, Mrs. Thompson, frowned when she turned in her math homework, half-finished and scribbled. "Catherine, is everything okay?" Mrs. Thompson asked gently. Catherine nodded, not meeting her eyes. "I'm fine," she mumbled, hurrying back to her desk. But she wasn't fine. She was scared and confused, and the weight of it all pressed down on her small shoulders. At recess, she sat alone on the swings, watching other kids play with a detached sort of longing. Her best friend Sarah bounded over. "Want to play hopscotch?" Catherine shook her head. "Not today." Sarah's smile faded. "You never want to play anymore. What's wrong?" "Nothing," Catherine lied. How could she explain something she didn't understand herself? The days blurred together, each one marked by tense silences and muffled arguments. Catherine began to dread going home. She lingered after school, dawdling on the playground until the last possible moment. One evening, she paused outside the kitchen door, hearing her parents' hushed voices. "We can't go on like this," her father was saying. "What about Catherine?" "Don't you dare use her against me," her mother hissed. "This isn't about her." "Everything is about her," her father's voice cracked. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to her?" Catherine's breath caught in her throat. They were fighting because of her. Because she'd found that stupid receipt and shown it to her dad. This was all her fault. She fled to her room, hot tears spilling down her cheeks. She crawled under her bed, clutching her teddy bear. "I'm sorry," she whispered into its fur. "I'm so sorry." The next few weeks passed in a haze of tension and unspoken words. Catherine's grades continued to slip. Her teacher called home, concerned about her sudden withdrawal, but Catherine barely registered the conversation her father had with Mrs. Thompson, promising to look into it. She started having nightmares, dreams where she was lost in a thick fog, calling out for her parents. But when she found them, they turned away, leaving her alone in the mist. She'd wake up in a cold sweat, her pillow damp with tears. Her mother's absences became more frequent. Catherine would come home from school to find only her father there, his eyes red-rimmed and distant. He'd try to engage her, asking about her day, but the words felt hollow. One night, Catherine woke to the sound of shattering glass. She crept to the top of the stairs, heart pounding. "When did it start?" Her father's voice, low and dangerous. "Tell me exactly when this began." "Paul, please!" Her mother sounded desperate. "Answer me!" Another crash. Catherine flinched, pressing herself against the wall. 6 months, her mother whispered. It's been 6 months. The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine slipped back to her room, shaking. 6 months. 6 months of lies, of secrets. She crawled into bed, pulling the covers tight around her. As she lay there, listening to the murmur of her parents' voices downstairs, Catherine felt something inside her harden. The world she'd known, the safe haven of her family, was crumbling, and she was powerless to stop it. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing with all her might that she could go back. Back to that day in her mother's closet, before she'd found the receipt, before everything had fallen apart. Catherine watched helplessly as her father packed his clothes into a suitcase, her world crumbling around her. Each shirt, each pair of socks disappeared into the bag, like pieces of her life being stripped away. She wanted to beg him to stop, to unpack everything and pretend this wasn't happening. But the words stuck in her throat, leaving her mute and frozen in the doorway. Her father moved with quiet efficiency, his movements deliberate and controlled. But Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands as he folded a sweater. When he finally zipped up the suitcase, the sound felt like a gunshot in the silence of the room. He turned to face her, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. "It's just for a little while, kiddo," he said, his voice rough. He knelt down, resting a hand on her shoulder. The weight of it felt like an anchor, the last thing holding her in place as everything else spun out of control. Catherine nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She threw her arms around his neck, breathing in the familiar scent of his aftershave. For a moment, she was 5 years old again, safe in her daddy's arms. But then he was pulling away, standing up, wheeling the suitcase towards the door. The sound of the wheels rolling across the hardwood floor echoed through the house, a grim soundtrack to the end of her childhood. As the front door closed behind him, Catherine felt something inside her shatter. The days that followed blurred together, a haze of new routines and unspoken tensions. Every few days, Catherine packed her own small bag, shuttling between her parents like a human ping-pong ball. At her mother's house, the silence was deafening. Rooms that once echoed with laughter now felt cavernous and empty. Her mother moved through the house like a ghost, always with a glass of wine in hand. Catherine tried to engage her, showing her a drawing she'd made at school or asking if they could watch a movie together. But her mother's responses were distant, almost mechanical. "That's nice, honey," she'd say, her words slightly slurred. Or, maybe later, "Mommy's tired right now." Catherine learned to stop asking. At her father's new apartment, things were different, but not better. He'd tried to make it homey, hanging familiar pictures on the walls and buying her a new bedspread in her favorite shade of purple. But the sadness hung in the air like a fog, impossible to ignore. She caught him sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, staring out the window with such profound grief that it made her chest ache. He'd shake it off when he noticed her watching, pasting on a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "How about we go to the park?" he'd suggest, voice forcefully cheerful. "Or maybe get some ice cream?" Catherine would nod and smile back, both of them pretending this was normal, that their family hadn't been ripped apart at the seams. At school, Catherine moved through her days in a daze. Her were getting worse, her usual enthusiasm for learning buried under the weight of her home life. One day, her teacher, Mrs. Thompson, kept her after class. "Catherine, is everything all right at home?" she asked gently. Catherine nodded automatically, the lie coming easily now. "Everything's fine," she mumbled, staring at the floor. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't convinced. The next day, Catherine found herself sitting in the school counselor's office, faced with Mrs. Daniels' kind but probing questions. "It must be hard, with your parents living apart now," Mrs. Daniels said softly. Something in her tone, in the gentle understanding of her eyes, cracked the wall Catherine had built around her emotions. Before she knew it, she was sobbing, the words pouring out of her in a messy, incoherent flood. "It's all my fault," she choked out between sobs. "If I hadn't found that stupid receipt—" Mrs. Daniels leaned forward, her voice firm but kind. "Catherine, listen to me. This is not your fault. Adults have their own problems, their own struggles. What's happening between your parents has nothing to do with you or anything you did." The words sank in slowly, a tiny sliver of relief in the sea of guilt she'd been drowning in. But even as she nodded, Catherine couldn't quite believe it. If it wasn't her fault, why did she feel so broken? As the weeks wore on, Catherine became more aware of her mother's drinking. The wine bottle was a constant presence now, refilled nightly. Sometimes, her mother didn't even bother with a glass anymore. Catherine wanted to ask why, to beg her mother to stop, to be present. But the words died on her tongue every time, fear of making things worse keeping her silent. The weekends with her father always ended too soon. As she hugged him goodbye on Sunday evenings, Catherine clung to him a little longer each time, wishing she could freeze the moment, wishing she didn't have to leave, didn't have to go back to the hollow shell of her old life. "I love you, Kathy Cat," he'd murmur into her hair, using the old nickname that usually made her groan and roll her eyes. Now, it just made her want to cry. As Catherine hugged her father goodbye after another weekend together, she wondered how long it would be before her family felt whole again. The porch light cast long shadows across the lawn as she walked to her mother's waiting car, each step feeling like a betrayal. She climbed into the back seat, buckling her seatbelt mechanically. Her mother didn't turn around, didn't ask how the weekend was. She just put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving Catherine's father and another piece of her heart behind in the gathering darkness. Catherine watched her mother stumble into the kitchen, reaching for another bottle of wine, and felt a familiar knot of dread in her stomach. The early morning sunlight filtering through the curtains did nothing to soften the harsh reality of their life now. Laura's fingers fumbled with the cork, her movements clumsy and desperate. Silently, Catherine gathered her school things, her stomach growling. Breakfast wasn't an option anymore, not when it meant risking a confrontation. She slipped out the front door, the click of the latch barely audible over the sound of wine splashing into a glass. The school day passed in a haze of anxiety and distraction. When the final bell rang, Catherine's heart sank. She stood alone on the curb, watching other kids climb into their parents' cars, the pit in her stomach growing with each passing minute. An hour ticked by, then two. Just as she was resigning herself to walking home, her father's car pulled up. Paul's face was a mask of worry and anger as Catherine climbed in. "Your mother forgot again, didn't she?" he asked, his voice tight. Catherine nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She caught a glimpse of her father's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, saw the muscle jumping in his jaw. That night, after dropping Catherine off, Paul confronted Laura. She was already swaying on her feet, eyes unfocused. "She's fine, Paul," Laura snapped, words slurring together. "You're overreacting." Paul's patience, worn thin by months of this, finally snapped. "No, Laura, you're underreacting. This isn't about us anymore. It's about Catherine's safety." The next few weeks were a blur of hushed phone calls and tense conversations. Catherine pretended not to notice the way her father's eyes lingered on the empty wine bottles scattered around her mother's house, or how he scribbled notes after talking to her teachers. One evening, Paul sat Catherine down, his face grave. "Sweetheart, I need to talk to you about something important," he began. Catherine's heart raced, sensing the weight of his words. "I'm going to ask the court for full custody of you." Catherine's world tilted on its axis. "But what about Mom?" she whispered, torn between relief and guilt. Paul's eyes softened. "Your mother needs help, Kathy. Help that we can't give her right now. This is about keeping you safe." The day of the first custody hearing arrived with a suffocating sense of dread. Catherine sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, legs swinging nervously, as her parents and their lawyers disappeared behind heavy wooden doors. Hours crawled by. When they finally emerged, her mother's face was tear-stained, her father's grim but determined. A woman Catherine didn't recognize began visiting both homes. She introduced herself as a guardian ad litem, explaining that her job was to figure out what was best for Catherine. During her visit to Laura's house, Catherine watched her mother try to pull herself together, to present a facade of normalcy. But the guardian's sharp eyes missed nothing, not the lingering smell of alcohol, nor Catherine's desperate attempts to tidy up beforehand. In Paul's home, the guardian noted Catherine's tidy room, the well-stocked fridge, the homework spread out on the kitchen table. She asked Catherine questions that made her squirm, about routines and feelings, and which parent she'd rather live with. Catherine's loyalties warred within her, love for both parents clashing with the undeniable reality of her situation. The final hearing loomed like a storm on the horizon. Catherine wasn't allowed in the courtroom, but she could hear raised voices through the door. Her mother's voice, shrill and pleading. "I need her!" She's the only thing keeping me together. Her father's steady and firm. She deserves stability and safety. I can provide that. When it was over, when the judge's decision had been handed down, Catherine found herself looking at her mother across the courthouse steps. Laura's face was a battlefield of emotions: grief, anger, shame, all warring for dominance. For a moment, Catherine saw a flicker of the mother she remembered from before, the one who read her bedtime stories and kissed scraped knees. But then Laura's gaze slid away, seeking out the nearest bar. That evening, Catherine stood in her mother's house, soon to be just her mother's house, surrounded by half-packed boxes. She ran her fingers over familiar knickknacks, breathed in the scent of home one last time. Guilt gnawed at her insides, sharper than any hunger pang she'd experienced in the past months. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered to the empty room. "I hope you get better." As she zipped up her final suitcase, Catherine felt a curious mix of emotions. Relief, yes, at the promise of regular meals and a parent who showed up, but also a deep, aching sadness for what she was leaving behind. Not just a house, but the hope that her mother might suddenly snap out of it, might become the parent Catherine needed her to be. Paul was waiting in the car, his face a study in barely contained emotion. As Catherine buckled her seatbelt, she caught a glimpse of her mother watching from the window. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Catherine saw something there. Regret, maybe. Or the first stirrings of resolve. The car pulled away from the curb, carrying Catherine towards a new chapter of her life. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching her childhood home recede in the distance. It wasn't a victory, she realized. There were no winners here. But as the familiar streets gave way to new ones, Catherine allowed herself to hope. For her own future, yes, but also for her mother's. Catherine took a deep breath, her hand hovering over the doorbell of her childhood home, her two young children fidgeting beside her. The peeling paint on the doorframe, the faded welcome mat. It all felt surreal, as if time had stood still in this corner of the world while her life had marched on. "Mommy, when are we going to see Grandma?" Her youngest, 5-year-old Emily, tugged at her sleeve. "Just a minute, sweetie," Catherine murmured, her throat tight. She glanced down at her children, their eyes bright with excitement, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. With a trembling finger, she pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed through the house, a sound so familiar it sent a jolt through Catherine's body. For a moment, she was that little girl again, waiting for her mother to stumble to the door, praying she'd be sober enough to remember who she was. The door creaked open and there stood Laura, 63 now, her face a roadmap of wrinkles and regret. "Catherine," she breathed, her eyes darting between her daughter and grandchildren. "You came." "Hi, Mom," Catherine managed, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. She watched as her children surged forward, wrapping their arms around their grandmother's legs. "Grandma!" they chorused, and Laura's face lit up, her hands gently patting their backs. "Oh, my darlings," Laura cooed, her voice thick with emotion. "Come in, come in." Catherine stepped over the threshold, and the scent hit her. Lavender and lemon cleaner, the same smell from her childhood. It was as if she'd stepped through a time portal. The same worn rug lined the hallway, the same faded photos hung on the walls. Her chest tightened. "Can I get you anything? Tea? Coffee?" Laura asked, ushering them into the living room. Catherine shook her head. "We're fine, thanks." She perched on the edge of the sofa, watching as her children explored the room, picking up knickknacks and asking questions. "Grandma, what's this?" 7-year-old Max held up a watch, its face gleaming in the soft light of the living room. Laura's hand trembled slightly as she reached for it. "Oh, that was a gift for your grandfather." Her eyes flicked to Catherine, a flash of guilt and pain crossing her features. Catherine felt her chest constrict. That watch. The very one she'd discovered the receipt for all those years ago. The catalyst for everything that followed. She looked away, her gaze falling on the armchair in the corner. How many nights had she curled up there, listening to the sound of bottles clinking in the kitchen, praying her mother wouldn't drink herself into oblivion. As the children chattered, Laura attempted conversation. "You look well, Catherine. How's work?" "It's fine," Catherine replied, her answers clipped. She watched Laura interact with her grandchildren, noting the softness in her mother's eyes, the gentleness of her touch. It was a stark contrast to the woman who had forgotten to pick her up from school more times than she could count. After an hour of stilted conversation and the children's excited exploration, Catherine stood. "Mom, can we talk outside for a moment?" Laura nodded, her face a mixture of hope and fear. They stepped onto the porch, the autumn air crisp against their skin. "Catherine, Laura began, but Catherine cut her off. "I need you to understand something," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I'm here because my children deserve to know their grandmother. But this doesn't change anything between us." Laura's face crumpled. "I know I hurt you. I've been sober for 10 years now, and every day I regret. Regret doesn't erase what happened," Catherine interrupted, years of pent-up emotion finally spilling over. "Do you have any idea what it was like? To be 9 years old and terrified to come home because I didn't know if you'd be passed out on the floor or screaming at shadows?" Tears welled in Laura's eyes. "I was sick, Catherine. I know that's not an excuse, but—" "You're right, it's not," Catherine said, her voice sharp. "Your choices didn't just affect you. They shaped who I am. Do you know how hard it is for me to trust people? How scared I am of becoming you?" Laura reached out, but Catherine stepped back. "I'm trying, Catherine. I've changed. I want to be part of your life, part of the children's lives." Catherine took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You can see the kids, but on my terms. I need you to understand that some wounds don't heal, Mom. I can't just forget everything that happened." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Laura nodded. "I understand. Thank you for giving me this chance with them." As they went back inside, Catherine watched her mother with her children. She saw the love in Laura's eyes, the careful way she listened to their stories. It was the mother Catherine had always wanted, arriving 20 years too late. When it was time to leave, the goodbyes were a mixture of excitement from the children and awkward pauses between Catherine and Laura. "We'll be in touch about the next visit," Catherine said as she buckled Emily into her car seat. Laura stood on the porch, waving as they pulled away. Catherine caught a glimpse of her in the rearview mirror, a small, forlorn figure growing smaller as they drove off. As the familiar streets of her childhood faded behind them, Catherine felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She couldn't change the past, but she could shape the future. Her children would know their grandmother, but they would never know the pain she had endured. "Did you have fun with Grandma?" she asked, glancing in the mirror at her children. "Yeah," Max exclaimed. "Can we come back soon?" Catherine smiled, a small, bittersweet thing. "We'll see, sweetie, we'll see." As they drove home, Catherine realized that while time couldn't heal all wounds, it had given her the strength to face them. She was not her mother, and her children would never doubt her love. In that knowledge, she found a peace she hadn't known she was seeking.